Professor Heinrich Spieker of Forest Growth, from the chair of Forest Growth. So he would be so happy to join us, as well as welcome, as well as Professor Jürgen Bauchus from the chair of silviculture from the University of Freiburg. So first of all, I would just ask you to kind of introduce what do you do under these, or like what is your research? If I just say chair of silviculture, maybe that means one than others. And so if you could just start explaining a little bit of what do you do?
Is this on? Yeah, first of all, my warm welcome to you also from the faculty. I'm not sure whether anyone else from the faculty has been here and welcomed you. It's a great honor for us that you have come here to Freiburg, and I hope you had a good time so far. It's been a bit difficult to rustle up the staff in the middle of the semester break and the weekend, but I hope you had a good experience. So my name is Jürgen Bauchus. I've been here in Freiburg now for 20 years at the chair of silviculture after spending some time overseas in Canada and Australia. And here in Freiburg, my research program was really also shaped by this question of how can we adapt forests to climate change. When I arrived here in 2003, that was one of these first mega drought years that we had. And coming from Australia, I wondered, wow, didn't expect that Germany was not different to Australia at all. That's how it felt. And that has really shaped the research agenda. So what can we do in silvicultural terms to adapt forests? And not just in terms of the tree species that grow there, but also what can we do to maintain biodiversity while we adapt forests through structural elements such as habitat trees and deadwood, and of course some of the concrete approaches to make forests more resistant and resilient and more adaptive through tree species mixtures, through stand density regulation. These are sort of cornerstones of the research program that we've developed here at the chair of silviculture.
Thank you. Yeah, Professor Spieker.
Well, it's an honor and pleasure for me to be here and to be able to discuss with you some issues. You are a really impressive big group from all over the world. My name is Heinrich Spieker. I work in Freiburg at the university already since 40 years. And officially I'm retired, but still quite active, I would say. And I'm also internationally active. My main interest is right now also, and already in the past, how does the environment have an impact on the growth of trees and the mortality? And this is, of course, nowadays a very important issue. We are all very much concerned about the climate change. And now the question is, how do trees react to climate change? And that is one of the big areas where I'm interested in. Thank you.
Great. We were also supposed to have a third speaker who unfortunately couldn't join us. She would be the professor of forest genetics from University of Freiburg. But now we're going to then focus more on these forest growth and silviculture aspects. And I would also like you, because this is going to be a discussion anyway, and not just a Q&A. So feel free to, of course, like if you have anything to add to each other's topics as well or questions, feel free to do that. But otherwise, I would start with a few questions on this growth and mortality exactly. So what kind of changes are we seeing in forest growth?
Well, the growth of the trees in Europe has changed already since quite some time. We observed that the growth of the trees had accelerated in the last 70 years. And not only in Germany, but in many other countries as well. You may ask a question, why do trees grow faster? And we analyzed this, and the conclusion was nitrogen, which is a limiting factor for growth of trees, has increased due to emissions from agriculture, from industry, or from traffic. Though that was a finding that was very much, actually took much attention, because we published this at a time when people talked about forest decline. And we observed trees grow faster. And this study was done some 20 years ago. And more recent studies, we look more to the questions also of climate change and impact on trees. And we observe dramatic changes in the growth. Whenever we have dry, warm conditions, the growth slows down and mortality increases. And we have observed it in the Black Forest now since 70 years. And there is a very clear relation between water availability and the death of the trees and the growth of the trees. And the most recent years were really dramatical, though we have now 7 times more dead trees than in average in the last 70 years. And in addition, the growth is reduced due to this warming of the last years. So we have really observed a growth depression.
Thank you. Also related to that still, on the mortality as well. So how is what is the sum? Like we look at the growth and we look at the mortality, or is it one or the same thing that we're looking at?
Well, that is quite interesting that it is closely related. We had a chance to look to the correlation between growth and the climatic conditions for the last 120 years, starting from 1990. And there is a really very close correlation. Whenever we have dry conditions, the growth slows down. Whenever we have cold, wet conditions, growth accelerates. And this is a periodical change, and actually rather regular. Something like every 14 years, we have this period of better growth and poorer growth, drier conditions, wetter conditions. And the same is true with the mortality, actually. It also follows exactly this line. And so we can explain it that way, that trees are weakened in dry conditions. But then something else comes in addition. The bark beetles, they like these dry, warm conditions. And now the trees are weakened and the bark beetle are strengthened, and that means that the mortality increases even more due to the bark beetles. And I'm talking here, when I talk about bark beetle, mainly about conifers and actually mainly about Norway spruce, which is the most relevant species in our region commercially, but also from the area point of view.
You want to say something, Dad? Yeah.
Yeah, I would just briefly like to pick up this last point, because I think it's very important that we not just talk about climate change. Mortality, as has been pointed out by Heinrich Spieker, is often the consequence of these interactions of different disturbance agents, and quite often heat and drought stress is the trigger for subsequent mortality. And it's insects, but also diseases, fungal diseases, that are strengthened or become more prevalent as a consequence of these weakened trees. And when we look at tree mortality, we see these very different patterns of mortality in trees. In some of the trees, you see that death is a death by 1,000 cuts. The trees are basically set on this track 30 years ago through an extreme event, and then growth in terms of yearing width declines more and more and more and more, and eventually the tree goes over the edge through another sort of extreme event. But what we see now also more often is that trees grow actually quite continuously and then die very suddenly because of a very extreme event. Drought years of 2 or 3 in sequence, which we haven't seen before. So the story behind mortality can be quite complex, and it's getting more complex with all the changes that we see in our environment.
And are these changes like true across the board? Like we've already learned during this IFSS that we don't have that many tree species in Europe compared to other continents. But is this what is happening to the most important tree species, or is this like observable in basically everything, or like most species?
Well, the reason why Norway spruce is especially affected is because of the history of the forest in Europe and especially in Germany. As you may have heard, the forests in Germany were destroyed some 400 years ago. And then afterwards, reforestation started, and the mainly planted species that was planted was Norway spruce. And actually, it was planted outside of its natural range. Generally, this species grows in the high elevation in cold climate conditions, and now it's spread all over, also in the low elevation. And of course, this species is evidently most heavily affected. And other species may be a little bit more drought tolerant, so it really depends on the species we are talking about. One thing which I also want to mention is this variation in the climate. That is the main problem for the trees. They could, to a slow change, they can adapt. There is some we can call it phenotypic elasticity or plasticity, so the trees can adapt to average conditions. But when we have rather favorable conditions and also sudden not favorable conditions, that is what the trees cannot adapt. And that was actually, from my point of view, the point where we talked about this Waldsterben, which was discussed in Germany some 30 years ago. We had a period of very good climatic conditions, and then all of a sudden we had dry conditions. And then the foresters realized, oh, something is getting wrong. Our trees don't behave as we are used to, and that is, they were not able to adapt.
Just one more addition, because I think it's important in this current public debate that we also have. We see these large damages to Norway spruce in particular, and also where it has been planted off-site. So it's a native species, but quite often not native to the site. But we see this increased mortality also in native species in the sites where they would occur naturally. For example, in beech forests, not everywhere, but again, on sites that are quite susceptible to drought, those with a high rock content on limestone and so on. And when you look at our statistics on forest health, we see that, this loss of foliage, largely as a result to these dry conditions, occurs across the board in most tree species. So we should not think that simply by sort of getting rid of this situation with our, say, unnatural monospecific forests and just having sort of native forests on the sites where they grew previously, that will not fix the problem. Yeah? It may reduce the problem, but it will not fix the problem, because what we see happens across the board to different degrees.
Thank you. And you don't need to maybe put the mic down, as we're going to get more into the silvicultural aspects now. But as the management is being adapted to the changing conditions, what are some silvicultural approaches that are gaining popularity?
I'm not sure whether popularity is the right word, but there are, of course, approaches that are being more and more adopted because of necessity. And so I think in general terms, we can group these approaches that we have at hand into three categories. Approaches that are trying to increase the resistance, the resilience, and the adaptive capacity of forests. And so when it comes to resistance, it's, of course, trying to shift the forests towards more climate-adapted tree species. That also increases the adaptive capacity. Another approach is to give individual tree species more growing space so that they increase in vitality. They have more access to more soil resources. They can build up more reserves in good times and then recover more quickly from dry periods. So through thinning, for example. Thinning is also important to increase the resilience of forests in terms of mixing, meaning generating or maintaining forests with multiple tree species, ideally 3, 4 or more, and that spreads the risk. But not only that, mixing also has, with regards to some kinds of disturbances, effects on individual species. So they grow in mixture or behave in mixture differently than in monoculture. So the same tree species is less susceptible to some pests and diseases in mixture than it is in monoculture, or it may actually be, not in all cases, be more tolerant towards drought in mixture than in monoculture. And increasing the adaptive capacity has to do with the species composition. Disturbed, and that we don't have to start from scratch. I don't know whether you've seen this situation on your excursions, but a lot of these Norway spruce forests that have actually died, they had very little advanced regeneration. Because quite often in the cultivation of spruce and rhodia at the same site, and with very little advanced regeneration, and therefore the forest owners now go through this very difficult phase where they need to establish trees open under harsh conditions and with enormous competition from weeds such as blackberries, shrubs, and so on. And all of that can be avoided, at least to some extent or to a large extent, by having advanced regeneration in these stands.
All right. If you wish to add something.
One sort of aspect that one could add when we talk about changes and adaptation to changes is also to think about the carbon sequestration. And if we change species composition, maybe rely on species that are better adapted, it may also cause that the trees grow slower and the quality of the wood that is produced is less relevant for construction wood and so on. And that can also have an impact on the carbon sequestration. Another aspect which I also would like to mention is when we talk about changes, we also need to talk about the changes of the people and their ideas, what they expect from the forest. And since I am already, I told you, 40 years active here in the university, I observed all these changes. When I started, we talked a lot about fertilization to make the forest more productive. Today, nobody would talk about fertilization. Everybody would talk, how can we increase biodiversity and what measures can we do in order to make the forest more resilient and more diverse. And so the people's minds are changing very fast, much faster than the forest. And we also don't know how the people's mind will be in 30 years from now. And this is also a very important part when it comes to adapting to changes.
Yeah, and you were already bringing it to this like carbon sequestration, and which is also what the next question is a little about, because I would like to ask about the climate smart forestry, as that is, well, something you have been doing for 20 years now, or maybe you will explain if you haven't done that, if it's a very specific thing, but yeah, just shortly, what is that and how does it relate to all of these other management methods that you just talked about?
Climate smart forestry is a term that has been really coined by colleagues from the Netherlands, Gert-Jan de Boers and Verkerk, and it consists of 3 pillars. And the first pillar is the mitigative role of forests through storing carbon in the ecosystem, in the wood, also above ground, below ground, dead wood, in the soil. And the other mitigating force that we can use, namely through storing carbon in wood products and the substitution effects, sort of the material and then the energetic substitution. So that's one pillar. So, by storing carbon in the ecosystem and by reducing our reducing the increase in atmospheric CO2 through replacing fossil or energy intensive materials. The second pillar is the adaptation, as we've just discussed, simply to make sure also that the forest will be in a position to meet this mitigation role, this very important ecosystem service, also in future. And the third pillar is, while we do this, mitigation and adaptation, also to protect biodiversity and all the other ecosystem services. Yeah? And so, in many ways, it's not so different from, say, sustainable forestry as we knew it. It just got a different emphasis on these two first points, mitigation and adaptation.
And well, even though you weren't with us at the excursion yesterday, you are quite familiar with the places or the forest we went to. Is that something you could say would be climate smart forestry, or what type of forestry is that? Is it something this forward thinking?
Well, some years ago, I thought I should really change my excursion program because I a bit bored going always to the same places. Now I really I'm grateful to have been able to go to all these places again and again and see these changes. So the forest that you have seen here in the foothills of the Black Forest, 10 years ago, I would have said, these forests are in a really good shape. Yeah, they are quite well prepared for climate change. Going there now, I'm not so certain anymore. You have seen that the silver fir at these low elevations, at least the mature ones, are dying. And this will not be a place to grow big old silver fir trees in the future. You will have seen that even the Douglas fir, which is being regarded as the conifer alternative to Norway spruce and perhaps for lower elevations also to silver fir, is getting problems at this on the south face slopes. The mixture that we see is certainly something that matches this resilience and adaptive capacity criteria and is very important. But we see that some of these species really haven't, let's future guides. Yet you will have also noticed that it's actually quite difficult to change this in a direction where you would say, yeah, I would be quite content with the species composition for the future, because we see that, say, beech and silver fir, they regenerate profusely at these sites. So we have a kind of discoupling between these natural processes that occur and which have been used deliberately in close to nature silviculture or close to nature forest management. They're a very important part of that. And now we see that the results of that don't develop the forest in a way that it is adaptive or has a high adaptive capacity for the future. And what that means is that we will have to certain degree steer away from this close to nature forest management and use non-natural interventions, active introduction of additional tree species, etc. Other than, so in the past I would have wonderful example, for climate smart forestry because of the use and the kind of timber that is being produced there, this large Douglas fir that can produce timber that is put to very long lived products that can store the carbon for a long period of time and so forth. But the picture has changed quite rapidly, I would say, last decade.
Well, as you can see, we are really, when it comes to make recommendation how the future of the forest should look like, we are in a rather difficult situation. Because we have many aspects to consider. We want to maintain all the ecosystem services. We want to produce valuable wood. We want to produce diversity. We want to adapt the forest to climate change, and we want the forest mitigate climate change. And our knowledge is rather limited, especially when it comes to the question, how will the trees react when it gets even warmer? We observe already now quite many problems, so we are faced with really very challenging problems. And then the question is how to make decisions, how to optimize management under these conditions. And it is not just optimizing in one direction. If you think about resilience, we talked about this. Of course, we can think about how can we optimize towards resilience. But then we also want to do carbon sequestration and mitigation, climate mitigation, and then we need other measures. And then we want to produce wood also for mitigation in order to provide the industry and finally the house builder with renewable resources. And that is again a different measure. And how to optimize this all together is really a challenge. And there is no one simple way to go. And that makes our work as researchers, but also the foresters in the field, their work rather difficult under today's condition. And the conclusion is we need excellent educated young researchers and foresters that at least end all these different aspects and then try to make the best out of it. But we cannot make recommendation how the forest of 50 years should look like. As Mr. Bowers already said, we have to develop a forest that is open for many options.
Yeah, maybe one clarifying thing about that, like as a professor speaker already earlier mentioned that like people's minds change fast, like we're not looking at the same things we were looking at in the 90s. So is it, as you said that maybe 20 years ago you would have said that it was a great example, is it about people's mind changing or like the understanding of the whole topic changing, or is it the actual forest changing in this case?
It's basically three things that change quite rapidly. I mean, first of all, the environmental determinants, climate, and also the pest and pathogen regime has changed dramatically. This is something that will also continue to change. When you look at the statistics, for example, of introduced insects to different parts of the world, we're still on an exponential trajectory as a result of our global trade and travel. So that's changing. Societal aspirations are changing rapidly. What we want from the forest, also for us and for future generations. And then as a result, the forest is changing dramatically too, in its composition, in its vitality. So these three things are all changing at the same time. Against this background, we are trying, as good as we can, but with acknowledging that our tools are limited. We are trying to basically devise a path for the future.
All right. Feel free.
I have an example that shows that people's mind is not always oriented to the facts. And a good example is the forest decline that was discussed in Germany some 30 years ago. Everybody believed finally, or almost everybody believed, that the forests are dying on a large scale. And the reason I told you already earlier, the trees didn't look as healthy as they looked before. But then the media started to look to dead trees. And they asked the foresters, can you show me a dead tree? And I take a picture and publish it in my newspaper. And finally, everybody believed in this forest decline. So in this case, it was not oriented to the facts, but it was oriented to some news. And now coming to the climate change, we hear every day the climate is changing and we have fires and we have dead trees and so on. But in this case, as Mr. Bowers already said, it's really happening. So in this case, the journalists really tell what is going on in the field. But with my argument, I just wanted to say that the people's mind is very much dependent on the news, and then it's dependent on the journalists whether they really go close to the facts or whether they are telling something that is just fashion, and that can be also dangerous.
Yeah. Then to talk a bit more about the solutions as well, I have a few questions that I think can be answered from both a silvicultural and a forest growth perspective. First being to also talk about a bit about the topic that was about Douglas fir, but also more widely about alternative and non-native tree species. So to what extent do you think these could be a part of a solution or a whole solution, and what pros and cons do they have? Whoever would like to start has first thoughts.
As you mentioned at the beginning, we don't have that terribly many tree species. In Germany, we have, say, around 70 tree species, but many of them extremely rare. And particularly these extremely rare tree species, they are rare for a good reason. And therefore, they cannot be extrapolated to large areas and substitute main current tree species used in forestry quickly. So introduced tree species give us additional options. And they give us additional options in the sense of, for example, properties that we don't find in the native tree species to the same extent. And in the past, these were mostly timber properties that were being looked for. And Douglas fir, for example, is a nice example for that. It filled a real niche, in terms of growth and wood properties. I think in future, the focus will be much more on additional options for climate change adaptation, species that fill a climatic niche that few or none of our native species can fill. So I think that is another very important benefit. It allows us to increase the diversity of our forests, certainly not in the sense of basically replacing native species on a very large scale. We don't want to repeat the mistakes that we have made in the past, having landscapes that are dominated by one tree species. So I think no non-native species should occupy more than sort of ballpark figure of 20% or so, of the forest landscape, so that we don't fall into this trap anymore. And of course, this should be tree species that are tested, or of which we are relatively certain that they don't have negative impacts on the environment. And this relates in particular to invasiveness, basically taking over native ecosystems, or being a host or promoting other pests and diseases. So they need to be well checked. And we do have some species with which we have good experience. I want to add another point, which can actually be also quite important in future. Here in Europe, we have quite often tree genera that are represented by very few species, sometimes only one species in the genus. And when these tree species disappears, then a lot of other organisms, other species that rely on this particular species, they will go as well. So there are some estimates that we have on the European ash, which is disappearing, roughly 500 species that live on it. Colleagues have calculated for southern Sweden, for example, if ash disappears there, another 100 species are threatened with extinction. And these are mostly insects, fungi, and so on. Introducing close relatives of our native species that are actually able to host all these other species, we can make a significant
place back in my country. So, sir, please, apart from legislative implications, are there any silvicultural implications that is stopping the country from getting much exotic trees? Thank you.
So the first question was why so little artificial regeneration in our forests, where we could see in our last National Forest Inventory that 85% of all regeneration was actually of natural origin. It has to do with this prevailing forest management paradigm of close-to-nature forestry. That has a very clear also economic background, because the most substantial cost savings in forestry that were gained towards the end of the last century and beginning of this century was by replacing artificial regeneration through natural regeneration. Now here, when you establish a hectare of a broadleaf species, say oak or so, this may cost you 20,000 euros a hectare. And if you compare that with establishing a plantation of eucalypts in Brazil, which may cost 2,000 euros or 2,500 euros a hectare, you can see that it is very important to have these cost savings if you want to be competitive with your product in an international market. However, at the moment, we see that we need much more artificial regeneration because of this shift in species composition and to restock these areas that have been disturbed on a large scale. And it's at the moment a question of actually gearing up the capacities again in nurseries and so on to actually produce enough growing stock for planting. Yeah.
I just want to emphasize this economic aspect of high salary. When you go back 70 years, you could buy for 1 cubic meter of saw timber, you could buy 50 hours of work. Today, you can buy 2 hours of work for the same amount of food. That shows you that the whole forest management has to be quite different. And then, of course, close to nature management is one option to save money. To your second question about this legislation of non-native tree species, there is actually in Germany, it's not forbidden. In Norway, it's totally forbidden. And in Romania, it's also totally forbidden to plant non-native species, also for private forest owners. In Germany, it's not forbidden, but if you want to have your forest certified, you should not have more than 20% of non-native tree species in your forest.
Thank you. We're taking the next question from online. I'm going to remind you about the code in case you also want to ask your questions there. So it's on slido.com 1613817. The question is from Volodymyr. What is your opinion on future changes in forestry, land separation or integration in terms of non-native species introduction and provision of ecosystems?
At the moment, we have a rather integrative way of managing our forests. Integrative in the way that most forest management goals are being pursued on the same area of forest. So not segregative, where we have areas, say, that are dedicated to production and others to protection. You may have heard about these figures. Currently, the area in Germany that is in strictly protected reserves, such as national park, core zones of national parks, etc., is less than 3 or just around 3% of the total forest area. And so the focus has always been in the past to integrate this more. Whether that is a good model for the future or not is really a question of negotiation and values. What we certainly should be aware of is that if we are going to be more segregative, and the push for segregation is at the moment really only exclusively for having more strict reserves. There is no move for having segregation towards very productive plantations, for example, with exotic species. Then we should really talk about these three pillars that we really need in sustainable forestry, which is also being used in this triad approach, which has sort of a partial segregation, where you have an area and strict reserves, perhaps around 10, 15%. But then you also have an area in very productive stands. That may also be, discussion is not going that way. And I'm fairly certain that it would be a very difficult public discussion to dedicate land to very productive plantations. Yeah? It's much easier to ask for more strict reserves. But if we do that, we should be aware that we will have tremendous leakage effects. Yeah, we have already leakage effects in Europe. Now, Europe is a net importer of wood, and the wood that we import has an impact on biodiversity in other parts of the world. So if we set aside more area here, without reducing our consumption pattern, we will simply generate more leakage and have an effect also on biodiversity in other parts of the world. So I think it would be actually quite responsible yeah, if we find a solution here within Europe or within Germany. But then we need to discuss these figures very honestly. And I think that leakage effect that we have through our wood consumption at the moment is also something that is not really in the public mind.
Looking to this segregation integration worldwide, we can say that the segregation is more and more popular. We see more and more protected areas and more plantations. But when it comes to Germany, the situation is quite different. And I also think there are good reasons why the multipurpose forest is a more common way how to manage forest in Germany. And one aspect is the fragmentation. Also, the forest at this time is already rather fragmented. We have only 1/3 of our area is forest. And if we want to take care of biodiversity, we need that these fragmentation forests are somehow connected. And then it doesn't make sense to just make some parts protected and others we don't care about biodiversity at all. So that's probably the reason in the past, and I would say probably also in the future, this will not be the way to go. And we have actually good practices how to integrate biodiversity issues and protection issues into our managed forest. And that is also because the forests in Germany are managed differently than in other parts of the world. You should know that the average age of the forest in Germany, of the managed forest, is 77 years. In Finland, that is the time you cut the trees. And in Germany, this is an average. So you see that we already in the existing forest take care of these aspects of biodiversity. It can be more. And we also have a deadwood project, and we have old tree project and so on. And I think that is the future, that we do protection in the existing managed forest, but not try to put as much as possible under protection, because as Mr. Bauers already said, can we afford this in Germany to not use the forest that is available for production? And my feeling is we can afford a little bit, but not much. Otherwise, we really are depending on other countries if we want to use wood in the future for construction of houses and so on.
Thank you. other questions? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Leah. I'm from the US. I'm representing the Joensuu Finland LC. Professor Speaker told me I should ask a hard question. I don't know if this is a hard question, but it's something that I'm really curious about. So in the Bavarian National Park, we learned about their ideas on managing the bark beetles, and I found it really provocative and an interesting idea. So their mentality towards the bark beetles is more of that they're not really a bad thing, that they're kind of good in a way to help weed out the trees that might be like less resilient towards climate change, in order to like strengthen the forest in a way. So they aren't trying to fight the bark beetles. So since everybody else who's talked about bark beetles has been trying to keep them from spreading, I'm curious what your thoughts are on utilizing bark beetles to make maybe stronger like forests for climate, and also from a silvicultural perspective rather than the more biodiversity perspective that we heard from the national park there.
Go ahead.
Well, you are really asking a question relating to how to protect forest in Germany in order to keep close to nature or even natural systems alive. And this is almost impossible because all our forests in Germany are somehow man-made. And now just to put a fence around it and declare it as a national park does not mean yet that it is a natural product that behaves in a balance naturally. And that is exactly what happens in Bavaria, but also in other parks, that we have an artificial forest. And this forest is now changing by natural conditions, but actually the dynamic behind it is not natural. So it will still take a long time that system gets perhaps more natural. And then that makes this whole discussion about a national forest in Germany different than from other parts in the world. And that's why I also think we don't need to extend these protected areas too far. However, this kind of protected forests are an interesting object for research, for observation, what happens without human intervention. And we heard before that labor is very expensive, and the cheapest way to manage forests is not to manage forest. And so here we have an example of what happens if we don't intervene at all, which is a quite important and interesting object and worth to be investigated, and we need this kind of parks from this point of view. So that was my comment to this national park in Bavaria.
Let me just add, the national park has the objective to let nature play out its way, and to perhaps develop the whole park into a more natural state. And the bark beetle is helping them to do that. Yeah, so it helps their objectives, and transform probably much quicker this way than they would otherwise. However, I don't think that's a model for the rest of the country. You know, we talked about climate smart forestry. I think it is much smarter to actually harvest these trees that are there and that are highly susceptible, you know, large old spruces, to climate change and bark beetles, to harvest them in a controlled way and use them most effectively for climate mitigation purposes. You know, make sure that the forest owners actually get the most for it by selling it as sound wood, and not having sort of a change by catastrophe, where we have, you know, millions of cubic meters of this timber swamping the market. So it's actually not used to its most climate mitigation benefit effect, but is being shipped off or just chipped for energy or whatever. And I think it's got to do, or you can only answer that question also with the other purposes that this wood could fulfill, rather than, you know, standing dead trees in a national park. No, we have other objectives that we can better meet with sound timber that we harvest in a controlled way.
Great. Then we have another question from online again. Getting a bit back to these ecosystem services that we already kind of touched. This question is from Matthias Chorba. In what way can people be persuaded to pay for these ecosystem services, and can you cite working examples from the world?
There are examples from around where people pay for ecosystem services, and they're sometimes the direct beneficiaries of these ecosystem services. For example, those that use clean water further downstream, they pay the people upstream to manage the forest so that there is no sedimentation, etc. I'm not sure whether we have representatives here from Costa Rica, but they probably report on these cases, because Costa Rica is a where this payment for ecosystem services schemes have been quite advanced. There are other examples where, from Australia, where people actually afforest catchments to reduce the salinity in stream water, so that downstream farmers can actually use that water to irrigate their crops. Yeah? But the whole range of ecosystem services that we can obtain from forests is difficult to manage in a way where you have all these individual ecosystems that run under a different scheme. Think about the forest owner, who has a contract for this service and for that service and for that service, and has to basically prove the provision of that service in a quantitative way. The potential financial benefits are probably eaten up by the administrative load and also by the monitoring to actually make sure that all these ecosystem services have been provided. And that's why we didn't make this advance in this field in many regions of the world. And the program that I mentioned before, this climate change adapted forest management, takes a different approach by saying the most important thing that forest owners can do to make sure that we will in future still receive all the ecosystem services from the forest is to adapt them, yeah, and protect them. And thus, we don't pay you for all these individual ecosystem services, but we reward you for maintaining biodiverse and adaptive forests. So it's an indirect of rewarding forest owners for this provision of ecosystem services. And I think where we don't have ecosystem services that are highly rewarded, where there is a high financial gain and which are easy to monitor, this latter way is probably a smarter approach.
Then I think we have time for one last short question. So if it's not a short question, then okay, Agustin, and hopefully a short answer as well, so we can still finish on time. No worries. But yes, Agustin, go ahead.
Been really amazing to hear you. And my question is a little bit related on what is the level of alignment that you see between the different stakeholders in Germany towards this needed transformation, meaning private forest owners, public administrators, policymakers, or scientific community. Is there alignment on that sense, and also on the different scales of region, country, or even European Union?
I'm not sure what you mean by alignment.
Are they all thinking that this is need, or are some, like, for example, private forest owner opposing to changing species and diversifying and wanting to continue with the same model that they have now?
Yeah.
Well, I can talk about the private forest owners in the Black Forest. And they have a very special mentality. they keep to what their parents and grandparents have done. And their grandparents have planted Norway spruce, so they plant again Norway spruce, independent of the climate change. That is a typical Black Forest farmer, just to give you one example. And we have in Germany very few companies that own forests. So it's mainly, we have a few of dukes and rich people that own a bigger forest area, but that is altogether not a really big part of the forest. But we have thousands of small forest owners. And they actually are not depending on the forest, and they actually don't even very often don't care about their forest. So we have, without talking about segregation, we have quite a bit of area that is almost untouched because the small private owners don't care anymore about their forest. It doesn't answer all your questions, but at least part of it, hopefully.
We have certainly sort of bodies that say that they represent interests of public, private, industrial, forest owners, and so on. But we have an enormous breadth of, say, management intent amongst forest owners, you know, from doing nothing or protecting it all to using it very intensively for you know, economic gain from the sale of timber. So, you know, there's the whole diversity. And I think there's a large proportion also of forest owners that don't necessarily feel represented by these organizations that actually claim to represent them.
This diversity of ownership in Germany has a big advantage. We talked a lot about risks, and also our forest management varies even in short distance very much. That's why we have a very diverse forest system, which gives the system a little bit more stability. So it doesn't have only disadvantages.
Well, that I think is a good note to end on. We have some advantages, even on the face of all these problems that we're facing, but like there are clearly ways to face them and ways to go forward. But this is where I would end. And thank you so much for joining. Thank you for sharing your expertise and taking this time to come talk to us. And we have a little bit of something, a small gift to show the gratitude. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for listening to us, and have a very enjoyable rest of your experience and the trip that you have. I wish I had something like that when I was your age.
Well, you heard that you are needed in the future.
Cool.
Great.